Hello and welcome to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. Once again, I'm going to go through some relatively recent published, some of its research work and some of its commentary, but just to try to sew concepts together that I've spoken about before, that if you look at my YouTube channel, the Osteopathic Lyceum, and some of the stuff that's there previous, as well as looking back through the catalog of this podcast, the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast, you'll see a lot of themes that I have discussed that seem to be somewhat represented within this research. So the first thing I'm going to do for those who can see this, I'm going to share the screen. For those who can't, I will do my best to describe what I'm sharing and read appropriately as usual. So I'm going to just simply adjust something here. So once again, it's sliding through or rolling through the table of contents from the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine. The first article, so just to describe on the screen, volume 52 in progress. This, I believe, is supposed to be the June 2024 issue. So what happens is some articles will be published basically from the time that the previous issue is done. Articles will be published up to the point that there are enough articles to consider it a full journal issue, and then they call it an issue. So especially with online publishing, this is sort of the way it goes. So there's a research report. This is the first thing I'm going to take you through because I talked about it last time, or I talked about it in a previous episode, and I already have it pulled up, but I'll read the title from this particular screen, and then we'll come back to this screen eventually. The first one is a national cross-sectional survey of the attitudes, skills, and use of evidence-based practice amongst Canadian osteopaths. So if we go to the actual page here, one of the things that is important is that if you pay attention to the last episode that I did, or the episode covering this, you will see that there are some similar authors here, Oliver P. Thompson and Matthew J. Leach. They are the authors that were on pretty much all of the ones I talked towards. So the UK and the Australian one, as well as I believe it was the Swedish and Spanish, were Sweden and Spain were the other countries where this was undertaken. So you will see Oliver P. Thompson and Matthew Leach on pretty much all of them. So you know that this is essentially repeating the same method in multiple locations. They're looking essentially for consilience, or they're looking for a stable pattern. So if there's, I believe, statistically, it's central tendency. There's another term, and I mess this up all the time. But anyways, if you have random samples from all over the world, eventually those random samples will kind of come to the middle, because if you aggregate the data over enough random samples, you sort of get to a middle. Even if one random sample is to the right or to the left of what the middle would be concerned within, however you're visually representing your data or how you're numerically representing your data. Either way, they rerun the same thing over and over again. So I'll read the abstract. You'll be able to see how this is similar. And remember, this is about evidence-based practice. If you think back to what I had noted in the previous episode, evidence-based practice, evidence-based medicine is the scientific method as applied to medical practice, or in this case, osteopathic practice. You should not be put off or impressed by the title. Evidence-based practice is essentially just wordplay. It's the scientific method. It's the scientific method. I repeat, it's the scientific method. Evidence-based practice is not a thing. It is another word for a fundamental bedrock category. The fundamental bedrock category is the scientific method. The scientific method is an abstract, omnipresent phenomenon that varies in detail depending on where it's used. The scientific method would be essentially a problem-solving schema or a problem-solving framework, right? That is omnipresent regardless of circumstance. It is abstract, it is non-tangible. Therefore, if you want to teach this to people, a FAR transfer paradigm is the best. So if we look at this, and I will read the abstract, and it is exceptionally similar to the other articles. So Sweden, Spain, England, or sorry, rather the UK and Australia, as I believe what I had pointed to based on this repeated methodology with some of these main authors. The abstract to read. Background. Healthcare professions face increasing pressure to integrate research evidence into practice to improve patient outcomes. For many professions, the uptake of evidence-based practice remains poorly understood, including for osteopaths in Canada. The primary aim of this study was to determine perceptions, training, self-perceived skills, use barriers, and facilitators of EBP amongst Canadian osteopaths. Realistically, they should actually be exceptionally careful with that term. Technically, in Canada, they should not use that term, even though it's lowercase. So for those who can't see, this is lowercase. They should not use the term osteopaths in a strict technical sense. In a strict technical sense, referring to Canadian osteopathic practitioners, you should say osteopathic practitioner, osteopathic manual practitioner, osteopathic manual therapist. You should say anything other than osteopaths. It is a legally protected title in the country. If you are saying the term osteopath to refer to somebody in Canada, that has to be a DO. It absolutely has to be. It cannot be a European, Australian, Spanish, Italian trained osteopathic practitioner. They must be a doctor of osteopathy trained in America. So technically, this is just me being nitpicky and showing you why words can make a difference, especially within a legal framework. They should not use the term osteopaths to refer to Canadian hands-on practitioners. They should use osteopathic manual practitioner. That is nitpicky. I completely understand that the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine is not housed in Canada or necessarily centered in Canada. They can use that term, but a Canadian should not use that term. Methods. Canadian osteopaths were invited to participate in an online survey using the evidence-based practice attitude and utilization survey. To pull out of the reading, that is the same survey. They're just using the same survey and over and over again. No issues there. It's probably a validated tool in an appropriate fashion. Results. 408 osteopaths, response rate 13.4%, provided informed consent, of which 340 answered all questions. The majority of respondents had a favorable perception and believed EBP was important, 70.8%. Most respondents, greater than 65%, rated their skills in performing EBP at a medium-high level. EBP use was infrequent among respondents. Barriers to the utilization of EBP were lack of clinical evidence, time, and relevance to osteopathic practice. Facilitators of EBP use included having greater access to research articles and tools and further information regarding critical analysis of research. Although searching and consulting research information was rarely performed by respondents, they were perceived as the most important aspect of clinical decision-making, along with clinical practice guidelines, personal and patient preferences. The conclusion, Canadian osteopathic manual practitioners were largely supportive of EBP, but there was limited commitment to its integration within clinical practice. Improving knowledge and skills of EBP, addressing the barriers of EBP uptake, and integrating EBP into educational programs may improve the uptake of EBP within osteopathic practice. A lot of reading. I'm going to return to this conclusion to tell you what is occurring with this conclusion, right? And it is consistent to what is occurring with the conclusions of the other survey-based research projects that occurred in the other countries. It's the same thing, right? I'm not against what they're doing, but I'm going to tell you what the point of this is. Implications for practice. To read again, there is acknowledgement of the importance and benefits of evidence-based practice amongst Canadian osteopaths. Although Canadian osteopaths recognize the importance of evidence-based practice, there's limited commitment to its use within clinical practice. The major barriers to the use of evidence-based practice are a lack of time and clinically relevant osteopathic literature. Canadian osteopaths state that patient preference clinical practice guidelines, published clinical evidence, and personal preference were the most important sources of information used for the basis of clinical decision-making. Interventions that aim to improve knowledge and skills addresses barriers and fosters alignment between osteopathic models and evidence-based practices may help to improve uptake among osteopaths in Canada. Please excuse me for the stumbling and pausing. There's a few things in the way that this is typed out that probably need a little bit more editing. That's maybe me being nitpicky, especially as I'm running through it. I didn't necessarily notice that when I was running through it quickly because it was more of a skim. But that implications for practice, to be somewhat critical and to be judgmental, this was much better written in the conclusion. In the results. It was much better written in the results. The implications for practice is essentially just a recapitulation of the results in a clunkier way. The results did a better job of saying what was said in the implications for practice. So again, that's maybe me being overly judgmental or me being critical, whatever you prefer to say. So I want to look at the conclusion, because the conclusion is essentially where they're staking their claim as to what the heck you might want to do. One of the things that is a challenge in some ways in the Canadian osteopathic context is that essentially up until last year, all schooling was in private institutions. There is currently a program that is housed within Sheridan College, and I believe it's the Brampton campus. Sheridan College, traditionally, its main campus is Oakville. It's on Trafalgar. That's not going to matter to most people. But anyways, they have a campus in Brampton, and that's where they're housing their osteopathic school or their osteopathic program. There is a tradition at Sheridan of having an athletic therapy program. That athletic therapy program is essentially in conjunction, in some ways, with York University. York University has, within their kinesiology program, streams. One of those streams is the athletic therapy stream. So you're going to get an undergraduate BA or BSc, depending on your breadth requirements, in kinesiology at York University. And you can also concurrently get some other form of certification. One of those is athletic therapy. Another one is sports marketing and management. And I do not remember, I never remember the third, but there is another one, or at least there was, and I'm pretty sure that's still there. With respect to the athletic therapy program, broadly, very superficially, there is a lot of crossover with instructors between Sheridan and York. So Sheridan has been housing people who are athletic therapists, many of whom are also concurrently practicing as osteopathic practitioners because of their training in a private college. It is entirely likely, I do not know this to be fact, but when you superficially look at that, you can see that some of these people will very, very much appreciate being housed within a publicly funded institution, be it Sheridan College or York University. They would have insight into how that administrative process would work, what it's like to be there, and then how to set that up, because they have both the athletic therapy skills and the experience with that. Sheridan has experience with housing and running that program. And then some of those people would also be osteopathic practitioners. So there's familiarity with that environment. They build the program because the claim would very straightforwardly be that, oh, all of these are private colleges, and all of the problems with private colleges are the reasons why we're having problems with the profession. While that may be an argument to consider, it then leads to, we should do this in a publicly funded institution. In a publicly funded institution, you will constantly and chronically have the tension between the administrator and the educator. The educator wants the educational outcome. The administrator wants everything down on paper, and there are processes for that. So that is another challenge, because it actually can make it harder to be flexible to the needs of the learner. It doesn't always mean that, but it means that can occur. Now, once you are in that publicly funded institution, there is at least going to be some desire and drive for publishing. Now, with respect to the faculty that would be maintained at Sheridan, because it's a college, even though it is offering a BSc within a college, which is a thing that is non-standard in Canada, in Ontario. In Ontario, colleges provide diplomas, universities provide degrees. However, there is an opportunity where colleges are able to generate degree programs, sometimes in concert with universities, sometimes on their own. That is a thing that they have definitely been working on, and there's a way to do that. That is administrative. That is in relation to regulations and the government. But it is legit, at least if you understand how that is going to function between the institution and the government. Sheridan presents this faculty. There is going to be some drive and desire to provide some research output. This is an example of some of that research output, because there are people associated with the Sheridan program that are part of the author list. So if you know who those are, or if you want to, you can look them up. I'm not going to note it because it's not required. The thing that is occurring, and you can see it in this conclusion, you are getting, with this conclusion, the drive or the claim that there needs to be improvement. So you go ask the people within the Canadian osteopathic profession, and they didn't likely ask a wide variety of practitioners from a wide variety of schools. I can't see the full paper, but it's much more likely that based on access to a pool of osteopathic practitioners in Canada, they probably ask people within a particular professional association. That may not be true. They may have gone to others. I do not know this. But it's entirely likely that they went to a particular professional association, which would house mostly people from a particular school. It's not an invalid way to do it. It is a way to do it that would likely not necessarily be as representative as one would want. However, I would predict that the results would be just about the same. We think evidence-based practice is really important. We don't know how to do it all that good, and we don't do it often. That's pretty consistent because when you look at the previous articles that I've talked about, you see we think it's really important. We don't know how to do it that good. We don't do it often. That's consistent. So as far as central tendency or kind of, again, I mess that term up all the time. I really should sharpen up on it. But that is what you're going to see. It wouldn't really matter who they surveyed. You'd see that. At least that's what I would predict. What they're doing, though, is they're providing rationale to really heavily, within that administrative regulatory framework, really push into EBP. So the authors have an axiological position or a position of value and value judgment that evidence-based practice is important as a category. Realistically, I would suggest that they abandon the term evidence-based practice. It should be scientific method, right? Scientific method. And I would suggest that to teach the scientific method, they would be very, very well served to use a FAR transfer paradigm. I've spoken through that. I can show consistently why that is a valuable way to do what they want to do. They should likely abandon evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice requires the evidence-based. Osteopathy doesn't have the evidence-based. If you teach the scientific method, you may be able to generate people who can appropriately interface with both the requirements of the profession and the scientific method as an abstract, non-tangible, omnipresent problem-solving framework or problem-solving schema, and generate the fundamental research. Osteopathy doesn't have base level research. It has research that people in a publisher parish setting will combine their interests and like, okay, well, what does this do to white blood cells? It's like, if you can't prove or if you can't show in some way that osteopathic methodologies in a hands-on sense do their basic job, which is identify motion restrictions, alter motion restrictions in a consistent and identifiable way, stepping onto any physiological process is nuts. Trying to say that it does something to a specific nerve or a specific physiological process is unwarranted until you have the absolute fundamental basis that you can observably and consistently display that osteopathic practitioners can find motion restrictions and change them consistently. Up until that point, you have a problem. So, of course, people are going to have problems with evidence-based practice because the fundamental evidence isn't there. And then any evidence that does exist is built on a non-stable base. It's not a stable foundation. So this paper, regardless of the context in which it is done, right, whether it's the UK, Australia, Spain, Sweden, or Canada, it's a call within an administrative regulatory framework to say, let's do this EBP course and let's spread this out as EBP, right? It's an axiological thing. It's a value judgment of the researchers. I don't have a problem with the value judgment, but they're one step farther than would be required for what they're hoping for. The outcome they're hoping for is teach the scientific method. It is to teach it at the absolute ground level. Because if you try to teach people EBP and there's no evidence base, it's not going to help. You need to teach people to make the evidence base. Let's start with the scientific method, absolute ground level. And if over time it becomes obvious that the evidence does exist, you don't even have to transition into teaching EBP as this dissolvable category. You've already taught the scientific method. People are out there doing the research, generating the foundation, and then they will also have the skills to interface with it appropriately and help it inform their clinical decisions. So yeah, lots of talking to try to tell you that the administrative regulatory framework and the research world are playing together here based on incentive structures. You get a paper like this in multiple contexts. It's repeat of the same methods. I have no problem with the methods. I have no problem with the findings. I do have some problems with what they typed and how they did it, and how sometimes they have a large O for osteopathic and a small O for osteopath. And one point they say osteopathic manual practitioners, and other points they say osteopath with respect to the Canadian context. That's a little funny to me. I would figure that at the level of the journal and the editing staff, they would have cleaned that up a little bit better. But maybe that they're going to do that later. I don't know. Anyways, scientific method, scientific method, scientific method. No EBP. Forget EBP. Scientific method. Scientific method is a non-tangible, omnipresent problem-solving schema or framework that will vary with details. You need to teach that. To teach that, you are probably best served by using a FAR transfer paradigm. Okay, lots of rambling for that. The way this is written, the way that I've interpreted it, probably does a decent job supporting many of the claims that I've made over time. Maybe it doesn't. Of course, I'm fallible, right? But I must admit that I'm fallible because I probably fall in line more with being a positivist, such that the researcher is always the challenge, or the interpreter of the information is always the challenge. So maybe more people would need to examine my claims and examine what I'm saying and examine things that I'm saying it from, and possibly come to different conclusions, or maybe similar ones or ones that overlap. And then we would actually find where the consistent phenomenon actually is. So I may be the problem. Right? That I freely admit that, and I'm happy to admit that. Now we switch back to the table of contents for the upcoming issue of the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine. And there's two here that are basically Oliver P. Thompson. So Oliver P. Thompson, I do not know if Oliver Thompson is an editor or has some other relationship with the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine, but you will see Oliver Thompson's name on many, many things with respect to the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine. That's okay. You know, maybe Thompson is just doing a lot of work, and I don't know where Thompson is housed. I have nothing to say other than to say I consistently notice Oliver P. Thompson's name. So Pseudoscience, a Skeleton Osteopathy's Closet. I'll click on this, it'll pull up. So this is the first thing we're going to look at. I'll read the abstract. What is going on here? So I'm going to read the abstract. Pseudoscience has harmful effects on individual patient care, professions, and society more broadly. The propagation of pseudoscience and spread of misinformation by healthcare discipline raises questions as to the legitimacy and ethical standing as a profession. Osteopaths and osteopathic physicians are regulated by law as healthcare professionals in many parts of the world, with an expectation that relevant aspects of practice are suitably aligned with a scientific paradigm in the form of a commitment to values of evidence-based practice. This article discusses the system of pseudoscience and considers its historic, present, and potential negative impacts on osteopathy and professional progress. We identify possible incentives for some aspects of osteopathy and osteopaths to engage in pseudoscientific thinking, and in doing so, we discuss osteopathy susceptibility to pseudoscience and how practitioners may become more aware of and recognize pseudoscientific information and pseudo-expertise. So, pseudoscience, pseudo-expertise, the process by which osteopathy has come to much of it. If you look at my YouTube channel and you look at the Osteopathic History Project, I've done what I think is a mildly acceptable job, or I mean, of course, I think it's a good job, but I'm smarter to say acceptable job of walking you through osteopathic knowledge claims, right? So how the philosophy of science may examine osteopathic knowledge claims, how they were built, what they might mean. So there are a bunch of article or videos on my YouTube channel, the Osteopathic Lyceum, and it's the Osteopathic History Project. If you look through those or consume those, you will see how these knowledge claims were built. Maybe they do a decent job in this article. I don't have the full text. That's okay. But basically, they're noting that there are a variety of regulatory frameworks depending on where you are in the world, and the legal system is the thing that's going to guide you. I've said that many times. So it's also one of the reasons why the WHO document and any other centralized document trying to address osteopathy or osteopathic training is a real problem, and because it doesn't zoom out far enough to say what is the absolute bedrock of osteopathic practice, regardless of legal framework. That must be the thing that must be taught. And then the things that need to differ depending on jurisdiction should be the legal framework under which you will work. So a fundamental problem with the WHO benchmarks for training in osteopathy and the CSA standards is that they do not appropriately address the variety of legal frameworks, and they do not zoom out far enough and identify the actual bedrock of osteopathic practice. So that's a challenge. But yes, pseudoscience. Um, I wouldn't even say pseudoscience. I would just say poorly built claims, poorly built epistemological frameworks are the norm in osteopathy. Also, that osteopathy centrally defines itself as a philosophy. And in a textbook, which I have shown before, there is a definition of philosophy. It's essentially, writ large, appropriate conclusions that do not require evidence. So it is a formal way of thinking that come to appropriate conclusions that does not require evidence. That is not where osteopathy is practiced. Osteopathy is practiced between multiple living humans, generally speaking. So you will have what you would call a practitioner, you will have what you will call, depending on jurisdiction, a client or a patient, and there's an interaction between those two people. And that is where osteopathy occurs. It is not a philosophy. It is an applied concept or applied conceptual framework. It is a hands-on practice, applied hands-on practice of conceptual framework. You can say this a bunch of different ways. The reality is the same. There is more than one living person. They are interacting with one of them having the need for a change in some expressed or identified characteristic. All right. So I'm going to go back here. Another article, again, which includes Oliver P. Thompson. Oliver P. Thompson is not the main author here. The previous one, Pseudoscience, Skeleton Osteopathic Closet, is Thompson as the main author. You can always tell who the main author is or the lead author, because of where their name is in the list. This second article, Thompson is the third author or the last author, so likely had less to do with the writing, maybe more to do with the ideas. The title is It's All Connected, So It All Matters, The Fallacy of Anatomical Possibilism. So we'll click on that. We'll let that roll up. I will read the article or the abstract once again. So I'm going to read. Anatomy has been a cornerstone of osteopathic theory, practice, and identity since the discipline's emergence in the 1800s and continues to be viewed as core knowledge to the present day. The domain of anatomical knowledge has provided seemingly endless rationales and explanations to justify osteopathic diagnosis, assessment, and treatment. Moreover, knowledge of anatomy has been foundational for osteopaths' professional identity and conception of healthcare practice. Anatomical possibilism refers to the imagined, exaggerated, implausible, and unproven relationships which are claimed to exist between anatomical structures. In persisting with such an approach to theory, practice, and reasoning, osteopathy may waste time, energy, and intellectual capital, and as a result fail to take advantage of opportunities to develop more plausible, ethical, and person-focused approaches to patient care. So the same fundamental argument is being made here. There are problems with osteopathy's knowledge base. The foundational base of knowledge in osteopathy has problems. And the fact that, or you could interpret that there are implausible relationships between anatomy or unproven relationships between anatomy as explanations for what is found and what is experienced. That is what philosophy will do as a formal framework, whereas the scientific method will make that harder. You need to start to identify how the relationships actually function observably. So this article would also be, again, with Oliver P. Thompson being the individual that connects all of these things, be it all of the evidence-based practice survey research, be it these two opinion pieces. Oliver P. Thompson is consistent here. Oliver P. Thompson is speaking to a desire for evidence-based practice. I am not against in any way using evidence. I have no issue with it whatsoever. Evidence-based practice is a dissolvable category. It is not a category that is omnipresent. It is a category that will dissolve, and it will dissolve to the scientific method. Again, if you look back at the Osteopathic History Project that I have on my YouTube channel, you will see examples of how the osteopathic profession has historically done this. You will see that the osteopathic profession calls itself a philosophy. You will see that philosophy can come to a formal, or is a formal way of thinking that can come to conclusions in the absence of evidence. So the challenge is osteopathy is bad at science. Osteopathy is not bad at treating people. Osteopathy is not bad at identifying issues physically that patients have. Osteopathy is very bad at attempting to derive explanations from assumed connections in anatomy. Osteopathy is practiced outside of the patient's body from the external environment of observation, so any internal processes must be obscure, any internal structures must be obscure. If the scientific method is appropriately taught, practitioners will immediately recognize this. Practitioners do not need to be taught evidence-based practice as a emerged category or as an ontological category that is distinct from everything else. Evidence-based practice is not distinct, especially in definition of evidence-based medicine, from the scientific method. It is just the application in detail, right? So if the scientific method is appropriately taught, evidence-based practice does not need to be a thing. Oliver Thompson, axiologically, if you track very, very superficially, and please understand this is not a critique, this is not in any way negative. This is suggesting that based on Oliver B. Thompson's visible written output, axiologically, Oliver Thompson likes evidence-based practice as a term. I have no problem with that whatsoever. I would simply suggest dissolve that category because it's not an actual category. If you were going to even do qualitative research with that, it would dissolve into the scientific method. Scientific method or the philosophy of science gives you epistemology, ontology, and axiology. Once you have those, other things will build on top of them. But the actual category, the actual omnipresent, non-tangible problem-solving framework or schema is the philosophy of science or the scientific method. Those terms can be interchanged, but the philosophy of science is actually the one that allows you to enact the scientific method. The details will change, but the fundamental bedrock category is the same. We're talking about the scientific method or the philosophy of science. So you see how these things start to play together. You can track somebody's output. You can track my output, and you'll see the stuff that I prefer. And you can then critique me on that. That is totally acceptable. But with respect to the educational effort within the profession, scientific method is the thing that is more required. Osteopathy is bad at science. You can track me. You will find me saying that. Osteopathic work, the actual practice, will often create a general range of results that are positive, generally positive, stable range of results. But osteopathic claims are nuts. Thompson and co-authors are pointing to the crazy claims within some of the opinion pieces. I completely agree with that. The call to turn that into evidence-based practice education, I think, should dissolve a little bit, move more to scientific method, scientific practice, things of that nature. The enacting of teaching the scientific method does not require an institution. It requires the enacting of the teaching of the scientific method from the philosophy of science. It probably requires a heavy emphasis on far transfer as how you deliver that information, or a far transfer paradigm, which means that you will explicitly identify the abstract, non-tangible problem-solving framework, problem-solving schema, which is the scientific method, which is going to include the terms ontology, epistemology, and axiology, and often the principle of parsimony, so you can add that one in too. The thing, or the principle of parsimony, is the explanation that assumes the least and explains the most, right? So you teach those. Now, when you teach in a far transfer paradigm, you must provide at least 2 examples of each abstract thing. So the abstract thing being epistemology, well, you need to provide a few epistemologies. Look back through what I've done. You will find multiple discussions on epistemology. If you look at the Osteopathic History Project, you will find many discussions of epistemology. You will find reviews of constructivism, positive and post-positivism, and postmodernism. You will see that in there. So there are, and then I will point to examples within the text as to where maybe things fall a little bit better. You will see examples of ontology, right, or a fundamental view of reality in philosophy or in the scientific method, the categories under which you're going to compare things, right? You will see axiology in there, the value or the value judgments of the author or authors. If you generate from there and use a far transfer paradigm, you must use multiple examples of it so that people understand that it varies in details, but it's always there. So my simple suggestion is stop talking about evidence-based practice if you haven't even attempted to cover the scientific method. Evidence-based practice is not the fancy clothes that the scientific method wears. The scientific method is fine on its own, and it would predictably, if taught appropriately with a FAR transfer paradigm, do most of what these author groups are looking for. So once again, forget critical thinking, forget evidence-based practice, FAR transfer. FAR transfer is the thing that is probably going to do more of what these people in the educational institutions are hoping that it will do. So thank you for listening. Hopefully you see how I'm attempting to balance things and say I am not attempting to do anything negative in the direction of the people that I am using their names. I am saying that I agree with most of what they're saying. I think the outcome methodology could be better. And the outcome methodology that they're looking for is FAR transfer, and they're looking to focus really as a category that is unlikely to dissolve on the scientific method. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.